question is the bill be now read the second time. The honourable member for Nelson.
Thank you, Mr President. Such a slight bill we have before us, barely 4 pages consisting of 5 clauses, 2 of which provide the substantive matter at hand today. So a slight bill, but one with such a telling and fraught backstory, really. And at face value, the bill is a straightforward planning amendment. That's the bill we're dealing with today. It's not about beginning a POS process for any particular project. It's a straightforward planning amendment to a process. It seeks to address one of the long-held criticisms of the State Policies and Projects Act 1993, which is the sidelining of Parliament at the conclusion of the integrated planning assessment process, except for the situation where the Minister of the Day recommends to the Governor that the project of state significance, otherwise known as a POS, should proceed, contrary to the Planning Commission's recommended conditions. So that's the current process, where there's one limited way that Parliament comes into play at the end of the process. This bill seeks to deal with that to some extent. Other long-standing criticisms of the Act include the lack of public appeal rights or judicial review, which I'll discuss later in my contribution. So to return to the role of Parliament, currently Section 26, subsection 9 of the Act provides for any order diverging from the Commission's recommendations to require both Houses of Parliament to pass a resolution before that particular project can proceed. As we've heard from the Government, this bill seeks to extend that requirement of parliamentary approval to those POS assessments where the Minister recommends an order in accordance with the Planning Commission's recommendations and conditions under some circumstances. So basically, we have a process for those proposed projects which qualify for the status of having statewide significance, bookended by parliamentary approval both in the initial order instigating the assessment considerations and now also via this amendment bill to the final order. However, not all projects are born equal under this amendment bill. The only must, as stipulated under Clause 4 of the bill, is in relation to potential projects of which the Government is the proponent, being required to come back for that second parliamentary vote. The equivalent automatic parliamentary oversight will not apply to those proposals, or will not necessarily apply to those proposals put forward by the private sector. Instead, private sector instigated projects may be required to come back for a second parliamentary vote, although the bill and the Government's supportive information package that we were provided with is silent on what those triggers to call in a private proposal for a second parliamentary vote would be. You'd think that vagueness would inject the element of uncertainty, which tends to instigate an allergic reaction amongst some in the business sector. Surely, if certainty and clarity of process is the order of the day, it would be simpler to provide a transparent and equitable process up front by requiring all proposed projects of state significance, no matter the proponent, to be subject to the bookended parliamentary approvals process as this bill seeks to impose on state-instigated projects. Mr President, that brings me back to the contextual motivation behind the appearance of this bill into the Parliament. It's useful to place the current debate on this amendment bill within the context of its origins, as that contextual lens can be quite instructive about why the bill contains certain elements but remains silent on others. Further, we also need to acknowledge there is legitimate public interest in this bill and its passage due to the associated political context that it sits in. Hence, we risk committing a disservice to those interested community members who may be watching or reading the Hansard now or into the future if we gloss over the catalyst for this bill's appearance and prioritisation through the Parliament. As others have already noted, the key motivation for this bill and its prioritised timing has been political expediency. On the 12th of May this year, as members will recall, we saw the announcement by members for Bass and Lyons, Ms Alexander and Mr Tucker respectively, of their intention to resign from the Liberal Party and instead sit in the other place as independents. Prior to that date of the 12th of May, it was touted that the proposed AFL Stadium at Macquarie Point would be dealt with under the major projects process as established under the Land Use Planning and Approvals Act 1993. In contrast, the New Independents wanted the stadium subject to the project's estate significance process under the State Policies and Projects Act 1993. As has been widely reported, this sudden and fairly brutal defection to the crossbenchers left the government teetering in a minority. Just over a week later, on the 20th of May, and just prior to the delivery of the state budget, the Premier publicly announced that he had secured a commitment from those two New Independents in the form of a Memorandum of Understanding. This MOU details, amongst other undertakings, the following at the top of the list, and I quote, "The Macquarie Point Stadium project to be progressed through the project's estate significance and removed from major projects." However, Mr President, it quickly became apparent from the news reporting of the time that there was a misapprehension of exactly what the State Policies and Projects Act provided, namely that the Parliament considered and any proposed POS twice. For example, an ABC News report of the 20th of May stated this, and I quote, "He, the Premier, said the stadium would be subject to extensive scrutiny. The Parliament will have two opportunities, one to set up the project of state significance and then finalise the arrangements moving forward should all the planning criteria be met," Mr Rockliff said. "There are two opportunities for the Parliament and the people of Tasmania to get to have a say on the stadium." End of quote. However, Mr President, as we know, that assertion was incorrect. It was pointed out by a range of commentators at the time as the Act then, and still currently stands, a POS would only come back to the Parliament for a second vote in any instance when the Minister decides to recommend a POS process with different conditions to those recommended by the TPC, the Tasmanian Planning Commission. Not as the two independents understood the case to be, or, as I gather, the government understood the case to be, and not what they understood their MOU with the Premier to deliver, I believe. And so then a month later, on the 22nd of June, the bill before us was tabled by the Premier and responsible minister in the other place. While an improvement on the current POS provisions in the Act, and while also filling a gap on the TPC project of state significance flowchart, which has now been correctly presented on the website, this amendment bill reinforces by omission the fact its origins are based in political expediency rather than a commitment to any democratic, accountable and inclusive planning law reforms. When it became evident back in May that an amendment to the Act would be necessary, many people, myself included, raised a range of other aspects that should be included in these reforms. On the 21st of May, I issued a media release which I raised not only the fact the current Act denies Tasmanians the right to judicial review, but also called for the following matters to be addressed to strengthen the transparency and integrity of the POS process as a matter of urgency. And I'll list them. 1, to amend the Act to provide for public appeals in the form of judicial review at the end of the process. And Mr President, this is not addressed in the bill before us. The legislation, I said, must also be strengthened to ensure the independence and impartiality of the Tasmanian Planning Commission and any established assessment panel to protect against actual or perceived political interference. This is a concern that has yet to be addressed, Mr President. It's certainly been a concern in times past when projects have been put through a POS process and there has been controversy about politicisation or influence on the panels. And the second thing in the statement I put out publicly was that the Premier must clarify whether gazetted guidelines detailing the POS development process currently exist, as specified in the Act, in Section 17 of the Act, and if so, ensure they're publicly accessible. If current guidelines do not exist, the Premier must detail when they will be developed and released. In response to questions I then subsequently put on notice, or put to the government here in this place, the government confirmed on the 31st of May this year that currently the required guidelines that are stated in the Act in Section 17 don't exist. And further, I'll quote from the government's answer to my questions, which was tabled in this place. The government said, "The government is of the view that the provisions of the Act, which was amended in December 1998 to include more detail in relation to process, provide the Commission with sufficient guidance in relation to undertaking an integrated assessment of the project of state significance. Should further guidance be required in relation to the assessment of a specific project, then this will be provided in the direction given by the Minister to the Commission under Section 21. It's interesting, Mr President, that if that's the case, if in fact Section 17 as it currently exists in the Act is no longer regarded as necessary and guidelines don't need to be sitting there waiting, why wouldn't we have used this opportunity as we amend the Act to actually tidy that up? if the government's explanation, and I accept the explanation, that there can be more detail put into a direction, why wouldn't we have tidied the Act up and removed that slightly odd extraneous bit, apparently, that's there, speaking about guidelines? So basically, Mr President, I watch this space situation seems to be there regarding any future POS guidelines which may be issued or gazetted regarding them. It seems that they're no longer intending to use that mechanism that is there in the current bill. A third thing that I called for at that time publicly was that the Premier must guarantee that funding is provided to ensure key community stakeholders opposing the project can participate in the POS process on a level playing field with stadium proponents. And while I recognise, Mr President, that last point is not necessarily a matter for the amendment bill before us, as it is an important outstanding matter of community concern still waiting to be addressed, and one we must not, I believe, lose sight of. So, Mr President, I raise these few examples of identified areas requiring attention and improvement associated with the current POS process, as they remain pertinent when considering both the design and intent of the bill we're currently debating, particularly in light of some of the commentary surrounding this bill, that it will, and I quote, improve transparency and accountability, and that it will enhance the role and involvement of the elected representatives of the people, us, as referenced in the Premier's second reading speech. In fact, the amendment bill before us consists of the bare minimum by which to meet the two new independence requirement for more transparency, accountability and involvement in decision-making processes surrounding the proposed AFL Stadium, or even perhaps in future the Mariners project, as has been alluded to. These limitations make it quite clear that without the political impetus the government found itself grappling with, this bill, limited as it may be, would not have seen the light of day. As such, it does not necessarily reflect a newfound commitment to strengthening the rigour or oversight of our planning laws, nor enhance the community's role in the planning process. I would like to be wrong, Mr President, and potentially the government's consideration of amendments during the later stages of this debate may, if we get there, may be an opportunity to be proven wrong on this point, and happily so, should that eventuate.
While you have a drink, I'd just like to welcome a group to our chamber from TASTAFE. Currently, we're debating a bill on projects of state significance, and all honourable members get to contribute their thoughts in the second reading speech. And once we go through this process, then if it passes, it goes into a committee stage, and then through the processes of amendment sometimes, and sometimes bills are passed without amendment. But that's what we're doing at the moment, and it's a fairly topical discussion that we're on about. You may have heard about the proposed stadium. This is a bill to facilitate parts of that through a parliamentary process. But I'm sure all members will join me in making you welcome to the chamber today, and thank you for coming to the Parliament.
Here. I'm just going to pick up on your comment there, Mr President, and put forward my view that this is not a bill to facilitate a stadium or the consideration of the stadium that's proposed for Macquarie Point. That can occur under the current bill that we have, under the current Act that we have. What we're grappling with today actually puts a greater threshold, in fact, into that Act, potentially making it more difficult to facilitate the stadium if it passes as an amendment bill here in this place. It does not give a green light to a stadium passing this bill. Just to put that on the record very clearly.
I don't think I meant that at all, no.
That's fine, I'm just responding then. Rather than correcting, I'm just responding to your comments, Mr President.
Cheers.
Thank you. It is a matter of confusion because it is being reported in current media around the passage of this particular bill through the other place, and as it comes to this place, that this is somehow the first green light for a particular process, the stadium. It's not. It's a changing the project of state significance process, inserting a requirement for a second parliamentary vote, which potentially, arguably, puts a higher barrier for the eventual potential consideration of a stadium or other project of state significance proposed by government. Back to my remarks as prepared, though, Mr President. I now wish to briefly mention the amendments to this amendment bill, which I intend to move, presuming the chamber votes to pass the bill into committee stage. I won't be reflecting on them in detail, but I want to mention them in my comment here. I circulated those amendments to members earlier this week on Monday. I won't go too far into it. Rather, I offer a brief overview because it might be useful to members' consideration as we hear other contributions at this second reading stage. One amendment seeks to insert new clause C. That's to provide an automatic repeal of this eventual Amendment Act should it be passed. This automatic repeal of Act provision has become a standard feature of amendment bills debated in this Parliament. Yet we haven't had an explanation through the Leader's second reading speech nor the supportive information about why it's absent in this amendment bill. Many other bills, or most other amendment bills that come through, have this as a standard clause. I won't read through a list. I do have a list here of ones that do, recently and currently the ones before us that do have this as a standard clause. The point being, Mr President, it did seem unusual for this provision to be absent from the amendment bill before us. It's my understanding that without an automatic repeal provision, should this bill pass and become an act, we would then just have a bit of a double up on our statute books. The Principal Act, the State Policies and Projects Act, which would be changed by this bill, and this amendment bill. So although that wouldn't be a problem, they wouldn't hinder each other in implementation or prevent any operation of those acts, it's not considered best legislative practice. So in the absence of an amendment from the government or an explanation for why it's absent in the bill they've presented, I've put forward, I will seek to put forward an amendment to put this form of clause into the bill that we're considering. The Leader may wish to reflect on that in terms of the government's view, or if there is further explanation to be provided by the government. In other amendments, the other amendments I intend to move relate to the matter of projects of state significance being subject to judicial review. They are new Clause A and new Clause B in the package I circulated to members on Monday. And as I mentioned earlier, Mr President, there is a further long-standing criticism that the State Policies and Projects Amendment Act 1993 is absent of any of that form of right of appeal. In fact, either a public right of appeal on merit or a judicial review of process. So my proposed amendment seeks to provide a mechanism for some judicial review element. And without going into detail of the proposed amendments now, I do wish to flag with members and on the record that for these judicial review related amendments, I've been advised I will need to seek leave to move a permissive instruction motion, and I refer members again to an email I circulated on Monday this week which outlined the need for that permissive instruction and the process that will entail. So that's all I'll say about that at the moment, and we may come to the point we deal with that in the process here in this place. Mr President, another aspect of the amendment bill which has raised some concern is the distinction between projects of state significance proposed by the government or the Crown and those by private sector developers or proponents. Apparently this distinction is required to address, so I've heard an argument run, address potential sovereign risk concerns. And to be frank, I find that sovereign risk argument somewhat less than convincing. The emphasis upon the dangers of uncertainty for investors appears somewhat disingenuous within the context of good, robust and transparent planning processes. A key underlying principle of such good, robust planning processes is the provision of a level playing field, as level a playing field as possible between the goals of proponents and the cultural, ecological and economic values and aspirations of local communities. It must be acknowledged that there is a degree of uncertainty faced by the community throughout the planning processes too. It's not just a consideration which may affect proponents, investors or developers. It equally can affect communities, that level of uncertainty. In the context of this POS process, there is uncertainty for all involved, no matter their position on any particular proposal of the day, when the initial declaration order is placed before each House and there's that initial parliamentary vote. Presuming that it's passed as required in the legislation, then there's a lengthy process where the merit of the proposal is then examined, debated and argued through that integrated assessment process. There is uncertainty over the findings of the final report that would come from the panel conducting that integrated assessment. Uncertainty whether the Minister of the day would then accept the Commission's and the panel's final report or recommend that the Governor provides a differing order detailing alternative conditions. And then further uncertainty as to whether both houses will then support that final order if that's part of what is required for that particular project. And that's the process as it currently stands, Mr President. But the one area where there's absolute certainty and consistency is that the current process applies no matter whether the proponent is government or private. And while I note that Clause 4 of the amendment bill before us provides discretion for the declaration order of any POS, whether proposed by government or the private sector, a private sector proposed project may specify that the final approval order has no effect until it's been approved by both Houses of Parliament. It's certainly unclear upon what basis the Minister of the day would utilise such discretionary powers and include that as a requirement. I did seek to find some information in our briefing to understand what would guide that, what would be the criteria on which that might be assessed, how would we understand that to be brought to bear. Is it something that will be then publicly available to have to be explained as to why it's there or not there in a private proposal? It's not clear to me that there will be any further clarity provided around that, although if the government in the summing up would like to provide comments around that, it would be useful. One thing we can be reassured of is that if a private proposal was to be brought forward under the POS process, if amended according to the bill before us, it would still have at least that first parliamentary vote. And if there was good reason, a good argument to be made that it should be mandated that there be a second parliamentary vote. And the reason for that might be it involves significant areas of public land or public funding. It might be that it has significant public consequence. They might all be good reasons and rationales for mandating a second parliamentary vote for that private project. At the time of the first vote, the Parliament of the day could take that into consideration in terms of whether it supported that first vote or not. So there's still some parliamentary control, I suppose, over the initial part of that, regardless of whether it's a privately proposed project. But it does give me disquiet that what we're setting up here with this amendment is potentially a varied process when it could actually be a consistent process. I do note that there appears to be some justification attempted about this distinction between projects proposed by the state or by the private sector on the basis that there's a clear correlation between government projects with significant economic, social and community impacts and benefits with a clear public interest. That's to paraphrase the Leader's second reading speech. But seriously, if we're bringing any project, government proposed or private proposed, through this particular process, we've already acknowledged that that proposal is of a scale or a magnitude that it qualifies to be considered of state significance. If it has a significant economic, social and community impact and benefit, it has by default a clear public interest. So to my mind, that there absolutely is no need to make a distinction here in the level of rigour applied by parliamentary scrutiny based on who the proponent is. And it's interesting to consider public interest is not defined solely by the source of funding for a project or whether the proponents are elected by the public or not. The public interest can be determined by things like access to public resources, whether that's land, water, air, infrastructure. It can be determined by the potential impact upon a place, impact on amenities, impact on lifestyle. And if we were to consider, for example, the most recent times the projects were assessed under the POS process, the Gunns Pulp Mill, which was withdrawn by the proponent in favour of its own enabling legislation, and the Walker Corporation's Ralphs Bay Marina proposal, both of which were extremely contentious and in which the community determined they had a considerable public interest, there would be no guarantee under the amendments made by this bill before us that either of those would be subject to a second vote of Parliament because they were privately proposed projects. So that is an inequitable formalised distribution, I think, of uncertainty here in what's being put forward in this bill. So, Mr President, to get back to the issue of sovereign risk, which some are alleging is heightened should there be any further addition of uncertainty in the revised POS process. This could be mitigated by removing this new proposed discretionary power and instead maintaining and extending the current certainty that all parliamentary checks and balances apply consistently across both government and non-government proposed projects of state significance. That would immediately remove the uncertainty of whether there will be a second and final parliamentary vote. It would also be consistent with the sentiment contained in the Leader's second reading speech, which stated, and I quote, "It is important to be mindful of the risks of damaging Tasmania's reputation for private investment based on predictable, transparent assessment processes." Predictable, transparent assessment processes, Mr President. I couldn't agree more, but ironically that's not what this amendment bill delivers. Of course, we cannot guarantee the outcome of those future parliamentary votes, should they come to pass, any more than we can guarantee the outcome of a final TPC report and recommendations on any POS process that is undertaken. That is the uncertainty inherent within any merit-based assessment, and one which applies to all proponents and opponents equally, as it should, Mr President. And surely that is preferable for all involved over the proposed element of uncertainty contained in this amendment bill, where neither proponents nor the community know whether a particular private sector proposal may be required by the Minister of the day to be subject to a second parliamentary vote, and if so, upon what criteria. Clearly, Mr President, some project proposals may be treated quite differently. Should the current Premier be the Minister making that decision, or should Mr Tucker, for example, or Ms Alexander be the Minister making that decision? That's an element of uncertainty, unnecessary uncertainty injected by this amendment bill to my current thinking for both the community and potential proponents. Mr President, I remain unconvinced that the distinction made between potential projects based upon whether they have state proponents or private sector proponents is neither desirable or necessary. Mr President, I now wish to briefly touch on the sudden commitment by the government to hold a review of the State Policies and Projects Acts. I describe this as sudden, as the first I was aware of this intention was when the revised second reading speech was circulated on behalf of the Leader on the 8th of August. And I thank the Leader for that timely circulation of the speech. The commitment in question, and I quote from the second reading speech, is this: "The Premier also commits to progressing a more comprehensive review of the State Policies and Projects Act within the next 12 months. The Act has been in effect for nearly 30 years with minimal amendment. With the unprecedented growth being experienced in Tasmania, it's important this review be undertaken now to ensure we have a suite of appropriately calibrated assessment pathways." Now, Mr President, I'm amongst the first to acknowledge that ostensibly it's good practice to maintain a rolling review of our statutes and to ensure they both reflect and meet modern and contemporary community standards and expectations. And again, we'd like to be able to take this commitment at face value as being an example of that good practice. However, I do wonder about the commitment to review the SPP Act suddenly appearing in the revised Premier's Leader's second reading speech when it was not included in the initial version we were provided. Quick chronology, Mr President. This bill received its first reading in the other place on the 22nd of June this year, which was the date the Premier's second reading speech and supportive information pack was distributed to us as members. The initial second reading speech was 2 pages long and had no mention of a comprehensive review of the Act. A week or so later, we started to hear about concerns such as sovereign risk, as I flagged earlier. On the 8th of August, when the debate began in the other place, we received the revised second reading speech, which now consisted of 4 pages containing further detail regarding the POS process and this new commitment to review the State Policies and Projects Act, on the basis that after 30 years the Act has had minimal amendment. As an aside, it is also the case that in those 30 years, the POS process provided for by that Act has had minimal use, in fact, Mr President. Hence, my query upon which I'm hoping the Leader will be able to shed some light is: when was it decided that a comprehensive State Policies and Projects Act review was required, and on what basis was it decided that that was required? Who was consulted, if anyone, in forming that assessment? Further, can the Leader clarify the proposed timeframe for this review? Is it the government's intention that the review will commence within 12 months, or is it the intent that the review will be conducted and completed within 12 months? That would be ambitious, I suspect. Lastly, Is it the intent of the government that any changes to the Act identified via this review would be applied retrospectively to any post-project assessment by the TPC which may commence between now and the review's completion? Or would any such project be playing out under the Act as it is now, or as it may be after this amendment bill, and not be affected by the review that's undertaken? I also asked in our briefing for confirmation, and I might put it on the record here so it can be confirmed in this place. The review would then, I presume, if it indicated the need for legislative reform, then give rise to an exposure draft of a bill to be put forward for public comment, and then that would also be part of the review process before potentially ultimate legislative reform would come to this place for consideration. Perhaps we could have that just confirmed on the record. And before leaving the matter of reviews of legislation, Mr President, I also wish to take this opportunity to flag that given some of the advice received when consulting upon my amendment to provide for some judicial review provision in the POS process, it's my understanding that the State's Judicial Review Act 2000 contains some potentially fundamental flaws and as such would also warrant a comprehensive review as well. However, I'm not going to dwell on that detail, but instead hopefully we'll have a chance during the committee stage to explore discussion further on aspects of judicial review. Mr President, another area which I take this opportunity to seek some clarity from the government on, although it's not provided for in the amendment bill before us, it's mentioned in the Leader's second reading speech, and that's the matter of recovery of costs by the Tasmanian Planning Commission. Specifically, the government has indicated its intention to table regulations, and I quote, that will provide for the full cost recovery of the assessment. So I'd like to ask if the Leader could please clarify for us whether that will apply to government proposed projects, or will the TPC be able to invoice the government for costs associated with undertaking a POS assessment? Is that what is meant when the government states it will move to ensure the Commission will get funded to carry out the assessment? At what stage is that funding intended to be provided? At the beginning to ensure the TPC has the means by which to undertake the assessment, or at the end as a recoupment? Given the TPC is a statutory independent publicly funded authority, it does seem a little strange for it then to additionally recoup publicly funded costs from government? Or is it the intent that the costs are only recovered from private sector proponents? Some clarity around some of that would be useful. Since the government has raised this consideration, and which is welcome, I think it's sensible, within the context of debate on this amendment bill, I hope that we can get some further clarity there, although I note it's not material to the bill that we're debating.
Through you, Mr President, I just wonder whether I could just ask members if they have multiple questions like that I get a little bit of advance notice so that we can have something ready for you, because it may take through the lunch break to get everything that you require.
Well, I imagine we've got a number of second reading contributions yet to come, and the Leader's summing up is quite some time away today.
Just saying.
I'm on my feet and putting my questions in second reading stage at the time that we appropriately make our second reading contribution. Mr President, on another note, before I conclude, I do feel the sad necessity to warn the government and the Premier, who tabled the bill before us in the other place, to avoid verballing this Parliament and its elected members by inferring a vote for or against this amendment bill is also indicative of support or otherwise for the proposed AFL Stadium. To attempt to do so is more than a long bow to draw. It would unnecessarily be divisive, combative, insulting and just plain wrong for any such assertions to be made. This amendment bill does not contain the word stadium in it anywhere, nor does the government's second reading speech, nor the bill's supportive package of material. Yes, as outlined in the contextual background as to the catalyst for this amendment bill, it's noted that sadly the bill's origin lies within the government seeking to shore up confidence that was shaken by its handling of this AFL Stadium issue. However, if it's passed, this bill stands on its merits, whether the AFL Stadium ever progresses to the assessment stage or not, a matter that would be dealt with quite separately and quite separately considered in this place. As stated previously, anyone who has paid the modicum of attention to the waves of planning debate in this state since, and possibly even prior to the introduction of the 1993 suite of resource management planning system, the RMPS, would be well aware that the SPPA, the State Policies and Projects Act, has been considered fraught in a range of ways over time. It has been considered fraught for, amongst other reasons, the sidelining of Parliament and the lack of public and judicial review rights. Hence, anyone seeking to opportunistically misinterpret support or otherwise for the belated improvement of transparency and accountability in an established piece of planning law, an attempt to extrapolate that as an indication of support or otherwise for any potential future proposal may be subject to this particular piece of planning, that may be subject to this particular piece of planning law, is both a desperate and a wrong assertion. It's gaslighting, in fact, to sum it up. It's beneath the Parliament and it's beneath the community whom we are elected here to represent, and I hope we don't hear any assertions of such made. So, Mr President, to conclude, I can state I will be supporting this amendment bill into the committee stage, where I have already flagged I will be seeking to move amendments. In doing so, I wish to reiterate my motivation is to seek to improve a current piece of planning law, the State Policies and Projects Act 1993, by strengthening its democratic elements. These improvements should apply for any potential specific projects of state significance, whether current or future, whether government or private sector. This apparent political lifeline for the government may have had its origins in securing confidence and supply in the other place. However, that is immaterial when this chamber considers the merits or otherwise of the bill before us. As always, we need to assess it against its stated intent and whether and how it seeks to deliver that intent.